Hey, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this latest Fiveable stream for APUSH. My name is Mr. Lagerway. I'm coming to you from West Michigan, and we're here to talk about some APUSH tonight, and we're here to talk about the market revolution specifically. So I'm pretty excited. It's one of my favorite topics in period 4 for APUSH. So in this stream, we are looking at the context of the market revolution, and I put it in quotation marks for a reason, because the market revolution is a term coined by historians. People back then wouldn't have used it. And then we're going to talk about inventions and their effects. We're going to give you some practice questions, things like that too. So to talk about the market revolution, we probably need to start with its context, where it comes from, and the big context that we're going to talk about tonight is, okay, does it actually exist? And then where does it come from as Americans move west? So one of the first questions to ask is what is the market revolution in the first place? For those of you who haven't gone over in class, let's go ahead and talk about this a little bit. This is people participating in broader systems of trade. So this is not subsistence level farming where you're producing enough for yourself and your family, and then that's about it. This is where you are going to be producing for people in faraway places, perhaps even interregional, international. Either way, it's going to be producing stuff not just for yourself, but producing for other people. So farmers are less self-sufficient during this time period, and they're going to make more to be able to sell for cash. This is only possible because of certain inventions that we're going to be talking about in a little bit. And there's some debate amongst historians as to whether or not the market revolution actually occurs during this time or whether it happened earlier. I know that Daniel Walker Howe, he argues that the market revolution is a bit of a misnomer because people were already selling for the market before this time period. He calls it the communication and the transportation revolution for reasons that we will soon see. But either way, if we're not getting into the historiography about this and debating about whether or not it exists or not, your basic definition is people are making goods to be able to sell to other people, and the market that is, imagine like a marketplace, but instead it's a nationwide marketplace. They're selling it to other people. And then this means, of course, that we're going to be using cash more and bartering less, a little bit less of the, well, I raise sheep, I'll give you a sheep. I raise some wheat, I'll give you some wheat. It's a little less Settlers of Catan and a lot more like Monopoly. So there's actual cash money flowing around. And if you tune into the Age of Jackson, we'll be talking about that a bit more on this stream because, of course, Jackson has all sorts of problems with banknotes and paper money. But that's not our purpose here. Market revolution, again, people producing things for a larger marketplace, selling to other people for cash, people that they perhaps don't know, and this leads to all sorts of interesting credit and insurance systems that we'll talk about a little bit later. Again, if you have any questions about this kind of stuff as I'm going through, I want to make sure that I'm keeping the 5 people interested, but also the people that haven't heard it all, I want to give you some basics. So if you have any questions as we go along, or I didn't define a term, I may have skipped over something, feel free to ask that in the chat or in the Ask a Question button. So westward expansion forms the basis for the market revolution. And as you can see right here, cotton production tends to move west and south after 1800. By the way, I'm going to ask you a question here. Let's do this one. By the way, what is this called? What is it called when they start to move to these new areas of production, particularly that crescent-shaped swath? We're talking right here in Alabama and then down here in Mississippi. Those are places where they have lots of cotton and the soil is incredibly rich. If you know the term for that, go ahead and drop that in the chat. Some people have called it the cotton belt. Yes, yes. I've heard it called something else as well. So cotton belt might be one option. I've also heard it called the black belt, not because of the black on this particular map, but because the soil was so rich, so good for growing things, it was black. And then it also, unfortunately, is going to come along with a lot of slaves as well. So you can remember that because of black, the black people that were enslaved because of the color of their skin, a lot of nasty racism going on here. That's actually going to be rather important for this time period because as Americans move west, the black belt is going to be increasingly important. They're going to make more cotton. They feel like they need, if you know what I mean, more slaves to be able to grow those labor-intensive cash crops. And as the soil gets depleted in Virginia, they're going to be moving it more toward the south and the west, and that's going to be Alabama and Mississippi. A couple of other things to mention. The Northwest Territory, it's not on this map, but you know it's just north of here, right? Northwest Territory is the modern Midwest. It's north and west because it's north and west of Virginia, where all the presidents were from and where all those decisions were made, right? And the Northwest Territories, those are getting settled during this time period. So in other words, you have people moving both to the south and to the north in places that are west of the Appalachian Mountains. And as you move further west, you have to be able to stay in contact with people that are further east, especially if you are a farmer who's hoping to sell your goods at market. So you can either go over the Appalachian Mountains, which is an arduous process. It takes a lot of time. It's very difficult. And especially if you're trying to transport wheat, just forget about it. That's one of the reasons why the whiskey tax, by the way, is so controversial for those Western farmers. They find the most cheap way and the most efficient way to ship their grain is to distill it into whiskey and then ship that whiskey. It's a lot more profitable. And so as people are moving to the Northwest Territory and to the Black Belt, they're moving west. They need to be able to stay connected with the East. And that leads to a need for some of these inventions and for some of the communication and transportation revolutions that we're going to see. We're also going to see the Louisiana Purchase. That was made in, another question for you folks in the chat. What year was the Louisiana Purchase? I'll give you a hint. Same year as Marbury v. Madison, that important Supreme Court case. Vicky's got it. All right, fantastic. Quick on the draw there. 1803 was the Louisiana Purchase. You can always remember that if you've seen that Schoolhouse Rock music video, Manifest Destiny, or actually it's called Elbow Room. And they talk about, and so in 1803, the Louisiana Territory was sold to us without a fuss and gave us lots of elbow room. People are moving west, and the Louisiana Purchase is just another example of that. It's not really getting settled at this point, but again, you have people moving on either side of the Appalachian Mountains and either side of the Mississippi River, and so people need to be able to transport their stuff. The Mississippi River, which, by the way, is down here, we're talking tracing the borders of these states and then going out here through the port of New Orleans, that's going to be very useful for a lot of people to ship their goods. The problem is you ship your boats down, you basically are floating on a giant raft, and once you reach New Orleans, you can't go back upriver. And so a lot of these people from the Louisiana Territory, from the Black Belt, from the Northwest Territories, have to break down their boats and sell them for lumber and then hike back up. Abraham Lincoln did this a few times when he was on the river growing up as well. And it was very inefficient. So we had to figure out a way to be able to go back upstream. So again, another sort of situation created a necessity for the transportation and communication revolution. By the way, what I'm doing here is I'm trying to give you a little bit of context, so that big C contextualization, which is a skill in APUSH. And also I want to be able to set up the why is the market revolution such a big deal? It's because it addresses some of these problems. We're also talking about a bit of a cause and effect relationship here, which is one of those big three historical thinking skills you need to know in APUSH as well. Lastly, we have the War of 1812. The War of 1812 is going to demonstrate to the country that the United States needs a whole lot more infrastructure if they're going to hope to be able to move men and material around the country quickly. Right? There's that famous Battle of Andrew Jackson in New Orleans, but a lot of the fighting takes place in the East Coast. Washington, D.C. famously gets burned by the British and Canadians. I mean, my goodness, if you're fighting troops on that many different levels and you're moving troops to different areas, you're going to have to be able to have some sort of infrastructure, and they don't have enough. They don't have roads. They don't have canals. They don't have railroads. They don't have bridges. They have to hack their way through a bunch of forests, and that's not good for national defense. So again, another reason why people think that they need this market revolution to happen. So that's kind of the overall westward expansion context for you there. Let's move on to talk about some inventions. And here's what I'd like some input from you. You probably can see two of them in the pictures there already, but what sorts of inventions do you associate with the market revolution? Go ahead and throw those in the chat if you can think of some revolutionary inventions perhaps that are happening during this time. While you're thinking about that, I'm going to start off a little bit earlier. Arthi, it does look like a telephone. Yeah, this is actually a telegraph. It's a little bit earlier than that, but similar design structure. Very much could see that. Yeah, so we got the McCormick Reaper that's happening. One of the biggest things, as Vicky was just mentioning, 1793, we have the cotton gin. Remember, a lot of the founders think that slavery is eventually just going to go away because they don't think it's going to be super, super profitable. Maybe it would have been. Historians debate about that. But either way, in 1793, Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin. Gin is short for engine. It's a way to be able to process cotton, and it produces 10 times as much clean cotton by separating the seeds than an enslaved person could do by hand. And so the cotton gin makes slavery enormously profitable, and that's what partially leads to this shift down to the Black Belt. And one of the reasons why the founders were sadly mistaken when they thought that slavery would just go away. So let's see. We have the McCormick Reaper. Yes, one that makes agriculture a lot more efficient as well, leads people to go into cities. We have the cotton gin. We mentioned that. The steel plow, invented by none other than John Deere. Absolutely. Any other ones? Telephone's going to come later with Alexander Graham Bell. Anybody know who invented the telegraph? You can throw that in there if you think you know that one. Got the telegraph, steel plow, cotton gin, McCormick Reaper. I'm going to click on a couple of these. Yeah, Samuel Morse, thus Morse code, right? Nice job, Vicky. So various inventions. These are going to be important. Some of these are in the actual APUSH concept outline. That's the outline. You can Google that if you'd like to look that up. the APUSH exam and course description, the APUSH exam outline. Google that, and you can see the outline of stuff that the College Board says you have to know these things. And some of these are taken directly from there. Others are just ones that I included because they happened during this time, and I want to be able to talk about them for various reasons. So the cotton gin is the one you start with, right? That's the one that makes cotton incredibly valuable. Now, I want to stop and talk about each of these in turn because they all have different kinds of importance. The cotton gin not only makes slavery incredibly valuable down south, but it also makes the North complicit in slavery. That's very important, by the way, especially if you're one of those people that cares about justice in history. You can't just say, oh, those racist people down south. And then if you're up in the North, like I am in Michigan, you can't just say, well, good thing we weren't racist and we were all really nice. First of all, a lot of people were racist. Basically, everyone was back then for a variety of reasons. But the North is complicit in slavery for a variety of specific reasons, one of which is going to be tied to the cotton gin, or several of which are tied to the cotton gin, and to this communication and transportation revolution or the market revolution. The North is going to be selling slave insurance. Remember, slaves are incredibly valuable during this time. The North sells slave insurance. The North is also going to be making slave cloth, aka the clothes that the people down south use to clothe their enslaved people. That comes from the very cotton that they pick. So there's an ironic, really sad cycle that happens there. And the North is going to make a lot of money off of that, as well as with the slave insurance and the banking and other such financial mechanisms. So please keep that in mind. It's not like the North is completely free of the stain of slavery, and everybody's basically complicit in this with the exception of freed blacks, slaves themselves, enslaved peoples, and Quakers. So the cotton gin is really important. We also have the Erie Canal. That picture actually at the top there is a cross-section of the Erie Canal, which I always find fascinating, and it shows how it moves up and down in terms of its height. So this is going all the way from, on the right side of the slide, going all the way from the Atlantic Ocean, and then going all the way to Buffalo and then Lake Erie. And it shows how the elevations change over time. Remember, the purpose of a canal is to be able to provide a smooth, steady, consistent stream of water such that you can move lots of bulk goods down them. And you often have a tow path off to the side where you have a mule or some sort of animal that's going to be towing the big barge that you have. Thus the 15 miles on the Erie Canal song, right? I got a mule and her name is Sal. 15 miles on the Erie Canal. She's a good old worker and a good old pal. 15 miles on the Erie Canal. Low bridge. Okay, I'll stop singing. But the Erie Canal is going to be really, really important for connecting the Great Lakes with New York City and thus the Atlantic Ocean. It makes it a lot easier to get to the Northwest Territories. Remember, we talked about that's one of the impetuses or impeti, not sure which one that is, for people being able to invent these things or make these things is because people are moving into these new Western territories and they need to be able to connect to out east. That would include New York City, which becomes a huge, huge trading hub. And it was the nation's largest port. Eventually it surpasses Charleston, it surpasses New Orleans. It's a huge deal. And this even helps to start the New York Stock Exchange for reasons we'll talk about in just a little bit. And yeah, Vicky was surprised that most of it's not there any longer. Yeah, it's kind of sad. I mean, we don't use it a whole lot. We don't use canals a whole lot anymore, right? You can still visit parts of it, and if you do have the opportunity to, I highly, highly recommend it. It's pretty interesting. There are also a lot of canals in Illinois, where I grew up, some of those that connect the Mississippi with the Great Lakes from that direction. So the Erie Canal, big deal. Also completed in 1825. It reduces the cost of shipping by sometimes up to 90 or 95%. So again, the market revolution, one of the big things here is that it makes things cheaper to move, more efficient to move, and if it's more efficient, it's going to be cheaper. So Erie Canal, railroads. You need to be careful here. The United States does not have a lot of railroads in the 1820s, even the 30s or 40s. By 1850, we start to get some of these, and certainly by 1860. There are thousands of miles of track that are laid in the 1850s, and so by 1860, on the verge of the Civil War, there's going to be a whole bunch of railroads. Abofu, thanks for joining us. No problem in being late. I don't give out tardies with this thing, so that's fantastic. So railroads are going to be incredibly important. In fact, they're going to be more important than the canals eventually once they get built, because railroads can run all winter long, usually. And as Vicky just pointed out, fantastic, I'm glad you're already there. A crucial thing to remember about all of these infrastructure projects, whether they be highways or railroads or canals, is that most of them are in the north. And the two regions of the country that are going to be connected the most here are the north and the west. Now, when we say north, we mean like New England area, New York, and then up into New England. And then the west, meaning Ohio through maybe Wisconsin or so. And so the south is going to be left out a little bit. Partly because they have very navigable rivers where you can bring boats up and down, but also because the South just doesn't invest in its infrastructure nearly as much for reasons we'll get to in just a little bit. So the North and the West are going to be drawn closer together. There's going to be some intersectional economic stuff going on there. You're also going to see the South get a little bit disconnected from the rest of the country. That's going to lead to problems and other sectional tensions that will eventually lead to the Civil War because of the whole slavery and other stuff like that. So railroads are really important, but remember, most of those are happening toward the end of this time period. We have the steel plow. Steel plow invented by John Deere out in the Midwest. After they started to settle the Midwest, they discovered that the soil was a lot heavier. It started to break the wooden plows that they had there. And so he decided he wanted to invent a new one. So the steel plow enabled them to be a lot more efficient when it came to the agricultural production. Same thing is going to be true of the McCormick Reaper, by the way. So the United States population is growing by leaps and bounds, and they need more food to be able to feed those people. And so the steel plow comes in handy. We're also going to see textile mills, both the Slater and the Lowell mills. Couple notes about that. You should be able to make some of these connections to other things in APUSH, such as Lowell mills, which we'll get to in just a second. So Slater mills, remember Slater goes over to England where they had started textile mills before. That's where the Industrial Revolution began. If you want to know why, take AP World, right? And he goes over there, he memorizes an entire textile mill in his head and sneaks it out because that was secret information and he wasn't allowed to write it down. They would check people at the border, and he managed to sneak over to the United States, build an entire mill by memory. And the next thing you know, you have efficient textile mills up north, largely in New England, near places where they had running rivers, rapids, falls, because it's all water powered, at least at first. By the way, brief aside right here. So I've been reading this really good book recently that's talking about study strategies, and I've been passing this on to some of my classes and students, and I just wanted to mention this to you folks here too. Some of the best ways to study are, one, to quiz yourself, right? Don't just read through your notes and go, yep, makes sense. But quiz yourself, ask yourself questions, answer rhetorical questions in your head. Make sure that you're able to make questions out of some of the things you're rereading, and then if you're not able to answer them, look them up. And the harder you have to work to remember them, the more it actually is durable in your brain. Second thing is to make sure that you space it out a little bit and you intermix it a little bit. So do some period 3, do some period 4, kind of mix them together. Make sure you review period 1 and 2 every so often, so it's not just a big cram session in late April. But the reason I'm bringing this up now is because another way to remember things, the best way to remember things, is to be able to incorporate new knowledge into existing knowledge structures. So when it comes to things like the Lowell Mill, you should go, oh, okay, textile mills. Where can we follow that to? Well, we could follow the textile mills down a rabbit trail and connect it to other things, kind of like a mind map. Follow the textile mills to the slaves, the enslaved people who pick the cotton down on plantations down south. We could follow that over to the Black Belt, things like that. But where I want to take this right now is the textile mills with the Lowell Mill girls. This is an important social change as a result of the market revolution. The Lowell Mill girls are frequently young girls, teenagers, early 20s, basically out of the house, but have not yet been married, although they are expected to be married, and they're given this opportunity to work outside the house. It's new. It's relatively unusual for women back then to be able to work, so this is a bit of a transition, a little bit of a change in continuity over time. Another one of those historical thinking skills. It's giving them some money, some independence, although it's still very patronizing because, of course, they have to live in these dorms. They have to have people watching over them. They're supposed to be on their best behavior, and that's all well and good, but sometimes they're a little bit forced to do so in ways that are not completely all about their decision-making, and sometimes grates against the whole freedom idea that we hold today. But these Lowell Mill girls will go on strike. That's a big deal. Women standing up for themselves. They're also going to be outside the home, again, for the first time. The market revolution is going to involve people working outside the home and working for wages, not just working for other people or for exchanges or things like that. That's a big deal. So Lowell Mills, if you just see that, you can connect it to other nodes of your thinking, including, wealth inequality, early unions, things like that. We also have interchangeable parts, also invented by Eli Whitney, or at least pioneered by him. And again, this is the idea that you can make something standardized. It makes it faster, makes it easier to produce. So that way, let's say you have a musket and the trigger breaks, you can order a trigger from the musket making company and you can just replace it with a new trigger, no problem. Also makes it a lot faster to make, and it also leads to a decrease in the number of skilled workers that you have to have and leads to more, again, assembly line, wage labor type things. We have the steamboat. Maybe Robert Fulton, maybe some other people invent this. It's a process, of course, right? There's never like one individual genius who creates these things. But the steamboat is a huge deal for transportation and for communication. You can send people and letters and goods on a steamboat and move them upstream. That's going to be huge, especially for the Mississippi River, right? So steamboat's really, really big deal. And then we'll also talk about the telegraph as the last thing for the communication revolution. Samuel Morse famously tapping out the sentence, "What hath God wrought?" as in, wow, this is amazing. And they're able to communicate over long distances, usually stringing those strings alongside railroads as they move. This enables people to communicate very, very fast. Eventually, we're going to have undersea cables going over to England and to the rest of Europe. So this enables transcontinental communication. This is a big deal. One of the things that I want to emphasize with this communication revolution and the telegraph kind of comes with the next two, and that would be we have, these are not from the concept outline, but are also important, various examples that you can choose on an essay perhaps. The steam-driven engine press, or the steam engine-driven press. Sorry, my apologies. And that just basically means something that can produce newspapers, but it's powered by steam. Newspapers become incredibly important during this time period, and the continuous roll. You maybe have seen those old-timey newspapers where it's like really long strand of paper, and it just prints and prints and prints and prints. It enables it to go really, really fast. We're going to have roller printers, penny press eventually. Either way, my point here is this. As communication gets easier and cheaper, it proliferates, it spreads all over the place. This is going to help antebellum reform movements. You can't have an abolitionist society unless you can spread your newspapers and your pamphlets to everybody. This is going to aid in Jacksonian democracy. You can't have wide national parties with broad participatory democracy if not everyone can get the news. People can't read. People can't find out what's happening in Washington all over the United States. So one of the reasons that Daniel Walker Howe, and I'm stealing this from him, calls this a communication revolution is he says, look, people were selling things in the market for a long time. What these new inventions do is they help people get places faster, and they help information move faster. And that is a huge deal. Another one to talk about, by the way, is the fact that because you have the telegraph and the steamboat and things like that and newspapers, this starts things like the New York Stock Exchange. If you want information quickly, you're able to make better decisions about crop prices, about stock prices. If you have information at your fingertips, you're able to make better decisions. And so faster communication leads to better economic commerce, leads to better investment, and it leads to the creation of the New York Stock Exchange. So the market revolution includes some genuinely revolutionary market principles, including things like stock exchanges, not just joint stock company kind of stuff. So who likes this and who doesn't? Let's talk a little bit about the motivations behind some of these things and the politics behind some of these things. So it's been a while since I've asked you a question. We just got through all of those inventions. Did you have any questions about those or about other things about why the inventions were important? We kind of read through a whole bunch of those all at once. I want to make sure we're all on the same page here. If you have a question, again, in the chat or the ask a question function, either of those are okay. Otherwise, we can go into this a little bit and talk about the Whigs versus the Democrats, the so-called second party system. Got to have some of that iced tea to stay hydrated here. Anybody know who those two gentlemen are in those photographs? If you think you know who one of them is, go ahead and write that down in the chat. Let's see. Abofu says, yeah, can you give a quick definition of the market revolution? Oh, yeah, sure. Let me back up slightly. Sorry to interrupt everybody who's looking at the portraits here. Let me go back. I said that a good definition for this might be something like this. So it's a participation of people in a broader economic system of trade. Again, there's some debate as to whether or not this actually exists here, but it's more like people are not just making things for themselves. They're making things for other people. They're selling things for cash. There's a bigger economic market happening. People are selling all over the country, not just locally. That's probably the quick and dirty definition that we can give you there. So inventions. Let's talk about these folks. And yes, some of you are getting this right. The man in the upper right-hand corner with the large forehead and the stunning hair is going to be Henry Clay. And the man in the lower left-hand corner with equally cool forehead and hair is going to be Andrew Jackson. Man, these guys just had really cool portraits. Yeah, so this is Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson. John C. Calhoun is going to be a little bit more like, wow. He's an interesting man as well, although they all have interesting portraits during this time. So Whigs are going to be led by Henry Clay. Democrats by Jackson during this time period, and then others after him. But he's going to be the founder, sort of this new Democratic Party called Jacksonian Democrats, to be able to sort of differentiate them from Jeffersonian Democrats or the Democratic Republicans. So the big question that people have to deal with during this time is, should the U.S. government get involved in internal improvements or infrastructure? By the way, brief definition here, infrastructure, remember, is anything that has to do with transport. So nowadays we'd include airports, but back then it includes, and today, roads, bridges, canals, railroads, rail hubs, things like that. Anything that involves transport and is sort of like the backbone of the economy here. So there were some big questions. Should the U.S. get involved in internal improvements and infrastructure? This is kind of like your Jefferson-Hamilton debate about the first bank of the United States, or about the Jackson and other people debate about the second bank of the United States as well. It all comes down to your view of the Constitution and what you think they can do. So the American system is the system that Henry Clay devises that involves a protective tariff for American economies. It includes internal improvements and funding for it. And that's going to involve the government spending money on that. And then also they're pro-Second Bank of the United States. So the American system, supported by Henry Clay, who we saw there, is going to involve a so-called loose construction interpretation of the Constitution. This should sound familiar if you talked about this with Hamilton. Henry Clay thinks, you know what, the Constitution doesn't explicitly say that the government can support canals, but it says that it needs to do everything that it can to support good commerce and support inventors and provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, things like that. Well, it sounds to me like that requires some infrastructure. And so they use this loose construction, this idea of the necessary and proper clause, the elastic clause, things in the Constitution that say you got to do what you got to do to get things done. And they say, this fits, let's do the American system. Andrew Jackson, by contrast, and the Democrats are going to disagree. They say, for example, in the Maysville Road veto, nuh-uh, you can't do this. This is unconstitutional. Jackson vetoes a road that was going to be a part of the Cumberland highway system in Kentucky because he says, look, there's nothing in the Constitution that says we can do this, therefore we can't do it. He is what's called a strict constructionist. So Jackson and the Democrats are not going to be on board with a lot of these things, these internal improvements, whereas and again, people local level are more than welcome to do that, but just not at the national level. The national government shouldn't be getting involved in that, whereas Henry Clay and the Whigs are going to be totally fine with this. So keep in mind there's a political element to this as well. There's a bunch of inventions happening, but there's a political element of how much should the federal government be involved in this, and it's rather controversial. So Whigs versus Democrats. If you need more on that, by the way, we've had some streams about that, and we will have some more, especially with the age of Jackson, if you want to delve more into those politics there. Also, with new workers, we're going to get new immigrants. So as you can see in this picture that is slightly overlapping with the word immigrant and now bothering me just a little bit too much, these people are leaving their homelands, leaving people behind and coming to America, and that's happened for a long time, right? Going all the way back to the Native Americans that crossed the Bering Ice Bridge or perhaps sailed down the coast. People have been coming to America for thousands of years. What makes these immigrants new? If you think you know where the new immigrants come from, go ahead and drop that in the chat. They're looking for jobs. People in America with new factories need these workers, and so they're going to provide jobs for these people. These people are going to come over here. China is going to be for some of these people, mostly on the West Coast and toward the end of the era. Yeah. Southern Europe is going to happen a little bit, but more toward the end of the 1800s. Hannah's got one of them. Germany is the big one that we're going to talk about now in period 4. Germany, as well as another one from Europe. I don't know if you consider Southern Europe. Germany, it's more like Central Europe, I guess. But we're going to have the German and the Irish. Nice work. And you got to know these for a variety of reasons. One, because they're going to be coming over, Irish potato famine, but just looking for jobs. And the jobs are here because of the market revolution. New people needed to be able to work on, say, the Erie Canal or the Transcontinental Railroad eventually in the 1860s, or to work in some of the mills or in the new factories. So these new immigrants are going to be largely Irish and Germans, and they're going to be coming over here. A lot of them are going to be controversial, though, because not only is there the classic, oh, immigrants are stealing American jobs type complaints from some of these more native-born Americans who weren't really native-born Americans. They were just immigrants who came here earlier. But either way, besides the whole job competition thing, what do the Irish and the Germans often have in common that makes Americans who are already there somewhat suspicious of them? If you think you know that, put that in the chat. Why are a lot of these English or Dutch people suspicious of the Irish and the Germans besides just job competition? There might be a few cartoons that one could think about. I've shown a couple of these in my class. Part of it's, yeah, Vicky, part of it's just language, right? I mean, anytime you have new immigrants coming here and they're not speaking the language of the majority, they're going to have different kinds of language, different traditions, different customs. Absolutely. There are some customs, though, in particular that Americans during this time period are not going to like. Maybe I can give you a bit of a hint. Keep in mind, this is the era of the antebellum reform movements, which were inspired by the Second Great Awakening. One of those antebellum reform movements is going to be something the Irish and the Germans don't particularly like. And keep in mind, the cause of the Second Great Awakening is going to be a particular brand of Christianity. Looks like this is something that perhaps we have not covered yet, and that's totally fine. So let's talk about this a little bit. The Irish and the Germans are going to have these traditions, and first of all, they're going to drink a lot. I mean, Americans in general drank a whole lot, but the Irish and the Germans are not two groups that are known for their opposition to alcohol. And keep in mind that temperance is an antebellum reform movement that some people are fighting for during this time. So they don't like the Irish and the Germans because they think they drink too much. Okay? And then another reason is going to be that the Irish and the Germans are frequently going to be Catholic. And remember, if you go all the way back to, say, some of the colonial era, the British and the French, or sorry, the British and the Dutch are going to be the Protestant powers, whereas the French and the Spanish are going to be the Catholic powers. And there's this long-running distrust of Catholics in American history. In fact, it's arguably one of the reasons of the American Revolution, because some of these people say, well, the English Anglican Church is no more than the Catholic Church, and they're going to try to put a bishop over us, and there's all this complaint about centralized power. Well, the Catholic Church has centralized power in the form of the Pope, right? And there's some concern about whether Catholics would obey the Pope or the Constitution. Can they be true Americans if they can't obey the Constitution fully? Protestants don't seem to have a problem with that, although you would think they would because they would be loyal to the Bible over anything else, but they didn't seem to really make that connection yet. So, by the way, this is a continuity in American history. I mean, all the way up even through 1960, when we elect our first Catholic president. Anybody know who that is? In 1960, we had our first Catholic president elected, and some people were a little bit nervous about him. Vicky's got it. It's Kennedy. Fantastic. Sorry about my nose being all itchy this evening, by the way. But John F. Kennedy, he's elected in 1960, and they were still worried about Catholics and can he be trusted even then. So the Irish and the Germans are Catholic. They're going to be interested in drinking, maybe more so than the Protestant Christians who are engaged in the temperance movement are. And so, therefore, we're going to have some tensions between these people. So the fancy term for opposition to immigrants is going to be called nativism. You could also call it xenophobia, but nativism is going to lead to people called nativists. And nativism is going to be a preference for Native Americans, not talking Indians, not talking the Sioux or the Comanche or the Apache or the Cherokee. I'm talking about Americans who were here earlier. Again, it's rather arbitrary, and that's why this whole nativism thing doesn't really make sense, right? It's just plain old racism in a different way. Nativism is going to lead to the rise of a different political party, and we're entering, now we get into the 1840s, 1850s, we're entering this time we have a ton of third parties in American history. Yeah, the two major ones are still the Whigs and the Democrats, but we're going to see a whole bunch of different minor third parties come in, about each with their own special interest. Does anyone know the name of the nativist party in American history during this time? Vicky, you clearly don't know nothing because you got it right. Yes, the Know Nothing Party, sometimes called the American Party or the Know Nothing Party. And if you look closely at this picture right here, it talks about the Know Nothing ticket, and it tells you who you should vote for. And then at the bottom, they say eternal hostility to foreign and Roman Catholic influence. So again, during this time, they want you to vote for their candidates, and they want a surprising number of seats in the U.S. Congress, even through the 1850s. They will largely fold into the later Republican Party in the later 1850s. Excuse me. But for this time period, they're opposed to immigrants, partly because they're Catholic, as you can see right there. And so there's going to be this backlash. That, by the way, is another continuity in American history. There is constant backlash to immigrants. I mean, you could go all the way back to the the Puritans who didn't like newcomers coming to their colony. But even if we're talking about modern America as an actual country, you can go back to the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1790, where you have to be a white person to become a citizen here. You could talk about the Alien and Sedition Act. The Alien Act, remember, makes it harder for new immigrants to be able to vote because of fears that they would vote for the French. Again, some anti-Catholic sentiment there too. And then you have here these new immigrants who are new workers who are necessary for the economy. There's some job competition fears. There's some nativism, and there's some just good old-fashioned racism against these people. Not to go off on too much of a tangent here, but keep in mind that race as a concept is very much just whatever people want it to be over time. It's not like there's a biological thing called race, right? And so who gets to be counted as white definitely changes over time. And the Irish and the Germans at this point are not really considered white. They might look paler. And so once they can speak American, and we do mean speak American, not like speak English, they can speak American. And once they start doing things like other native-born Americans, they can kind of blend in. And that'll eventually happen by about 1900 when we start to think of the, well, as Vicky pointed out, more Southern Europeans like the Italians, the Greeks, the Slovaks, the Poles, the Russians, all those kinds of people. Those are going to be the people that aren't considered white. Then they're going to be kind of scary then. But the Germans and the Irish are going to be okay eventually. Again, by nature of their skin, they're eventually able to assimilate once they can adopt sort of this English culture that already exists here. But for now, people are just really afraid of them, mostly because of the whole Catholicism. Let me stop one more time. Any other questions about this? So again, new workers for the new jobs that are created by the new inventions, that are created by this new westward expansion. There's a lot of new stuff going on. I want to make sure we're okay with this. Do you have any questions right now that I could answer? I'll give you a little bit of time to type as we talk about this. A reminder that the Irish are coming over because of the potato famine. Germans coming over because, well, there's some chaos going on in Germany too, I suppose, but also just looking out for jobs, looking for new opportunities, classic reasons to come to America. Looks like we're doing okay. All right, we'll stay hydrated real quick. And let's move on. So if we were to evaluate the market revolution, some of the questions that you could ask are, of course, was the market revolution actually revolutionary? I just did a stream a couple weeks ago about the revolution of 1800. Was it actually revolutionary? How much did it change? These are great questions to ask yourself as you go through your notes and as you think about these events, to quiz yourself, to go, okay, was the market revolution actually revolutionary? What did it change? What stayed the same? What qualifies as a revolution? Because, by the way, once you get to your essays in APUSH, your LEQs, your DBQs, long essay question, your document-based question, they might ask you questions that begin with that famous phrase, evaluate the extent to which. So if they ask you a question like, evaluate the extent to which the market revolution was actually revolutionary, you might be able to say, well, here are some reasons why it was, here are some reasons why it wasn't. So one of the things that historians say is the market revolution, not that revolutionary because they're able to make trades with other people. Americans are able to make trades with people long before this actually happens. And it's not that revolutionary. It's just a continuation of a process that began decades ago. Other people say, no, this is a big deal. Thanks to all these inventions, we're trading further and faster and more efficiently than ever before. So in that sense, it could be a revolution. It's also a good idea to give yourself potential short answer questions. Now, again, I've been an AP reader and I've been teaching APUSH for a number of years now, so maybe it comes a little more naturally to me. But one of the things that you can do as you go through your notes is to notice big themes and turn those into questions, or use the APUSH exam and concept outline to be able to make some of those statements or make some of those themes or learning objectives into short answer questions. Let me give you a couple examples. So this could be a short answer question. Briefly describe one specific effect of the market revolution on the American economy from 1820 to 1850. Let's go ahead and drop that in the chat. Go ahead and type out an answer. It doesn't need to be fully formed. We're not grading on complete sentences and things like that. But give me a specific effect of the market revolution on the American economy during this time period. And if you can make it a vocab word or a vocab word in a phrase, that would be fantastic. How does the market revolution affect the American economy? So anything to do with money, with trading. Let's see, Vicky says more goods will be produced outside the home. Indeed it is. We have less of this cottage industry stuff and we have more formalized factories. That's going to be a good answer. More goods are produced outside the home. Increasing communication, such as the telegraph. Abofu, I think that is a fantastic answer if you tell us how increased communication helps the economy. We kind of talked about that a little bit earlier, but you can use a variety of items as long as you, again, connect it back to the economy. You got to continue to ask the so what, who cares question, which sounds a little rude when it comes from me, but always be asking yourself that question, and I'm asking it out of love, right? I want you to get these points on this short answer question. The telegraph helps us to communicate. So what? Who cares? How does that influence the American economy? Give you a chance to talk about that a little bit. Anyone else have answers for us? A specific effect the market revolution had on the American economy. While we're waiting, I'll tell you this. You could just talk about how this makes it more efficient. And one of the ways it makes it more efficient is through something like the steamboat. So you could just drop a term like that. Steamboat counts as vocab. And you can say it makes it more efficient. How does the American economy change? It becomes more efficient. The economy is going to become more global, advancements in transportation. And Abofu's saying, yeah, we can get information a lot faster, especially during this time with politics and new rising political parties. Yes, indeed. Again, though, make sure you're talking about the economy. So people are getting new information faster, such as business information, right? So they're able to make better decisions about crop prices going forward, better decisions about stock prices going forward. This is why the New York Stock Exchange happens, because they have more access to information. Information is power. And yeah, if we asked about, well, let's go on to another one. Describe an effect of the market revolution on American society from 1820 to 1850. You could argue that politics are part of society. And yeah, so even if it was politics or society, as long as you tie it in a little bit, Abofu's answer about how new politics, new rising political parties use these kinds of communication techniques in order to keep connected with their members, that's great. So what's an effect that the market revolution has on American society during this time? Vicky's going to start us off by talking about how women will leave the farms and begin working in factories. Absolutely. An example of that, a nice vocab word to throw down there, would be the Lowell mills, right? They're doing that a whole lot more. We're also going to see an expansion of slavery, let's say, as enslaved people are going to be moved down into the Black Belt because there's going to be more cotton cultivation. The development of textile mills is going to lead to an increased demand for cotton, and that's going to lead to an increased demand for enslaved people down south. So largely, if you see society, one of those things that you should think about is if you see society, see if you can talk about women. Women are always around. They are half of the population, after all, and they're going to be important in American history. APUSH is no exception. Don't forget the ladies, says Abigail Adams. So American society, women are going to get all sorts of new opportunities, working outside the home, earning additional cash. We're going to move on from this idea of Republican motherhood to more of this thing of the cult of domesticity, which domestic just means home. So while some women are going to leave the home, others are going to feel more confined to the home. There's going to be this definite separation of the home and the work sphere. It used to be, again, as we mentioned, that people would produce things in their home. So home and work were kind of connected together. Well, now those spheres are going to be a little bit separated, and women are going to be a big, big part of that. American economy is going to get more efficient, more global. Society is going to have more women involved. Sounds good to me. Couple more short answer questions for your reviewing and viewing pleasure. Here we go. Briefly describe one specific effect of the market revolution on the American gender roles from 1800 to 1850. We kind of already answered this because you folks are too smart and ahead of the curve. Women are going to be gaining more independence. They're going to be able to produce more of their own clothing outside of the home. People are going to be making ready-made clothing thanks to the textile mills. So less sewing needed at home. More men are going to be leaving the home in order to make a living, and more women are as well. So that's going to change some gender roles as we go through the American Revolution, or the American Market Revolution. We have this one, a specific effect of the Market Revolution on sectional or regional ties from 1800 to 1850. We have not answered this one yet, and it's time to do our spaced retrieval, good memory self-quizzing way to study well thing. So go ahead and answer that in the chat. What's one way that the market revolution affects sectional or regional ties from 1800 to 1850? I'll give you one example while we wait for some people to type things out. A reminder that the railroads and the canals are going to be connecting the North and the West more so than the South, right? So the North and the West are going to get connected, and they're going to be transporting things through the Erie Canal, through railroads, through the Great Lakes. The South is largely left out of this, partly thanks to navigable rivers and partly thanks to the fact that they don't invest as much infrastructure. By the way, I promised we would come back to this. One of the reasons that the South doesn't invest as much in their infrastructure is because a lot of the political parties that have the power down there are Democrats. And remember, Democrats don't want to invest in infrastructure nearly as much from a national level. At a local level, sure, but it just doesn't happen that much. They are strict constructionists. They oppose the American system, and therefore they're not going to want to have as many infrastructure projects at a national level because it's not constitutional in their ideas. Let's see. Hey, Vicky, sorry about that. I kind of scooped you there. I was trying to give one example, but that was the one you brought up earlier, so you still get credit for it. Nice job. Railroads connect North and West. Yes, that's going to be really important. Please keep in mind that cotton is going to be a part of the South, but also a part of the North. A market revolution could be that the textile mills up north use the cotton from down south. That does lead to some sectional ties between the North and the South, and that'll lead to things like slave insurance and other such things, such that the North is complicit in slavery. The South, if we talk about intersectional or interregional ties, you could certainly talk about the South getting more interconnected. They see themselves more as exceptional. And not to go off on this huge tangent here, but notice the North during this time period is having all these new inventions. The North has all these new antebellum reform movements, right? The public school with Horace Mann, Dorothea Dix and prison reform, temperance, abolitionism, all these things that are trying to make society better, but they're also changes. And so to the South, which has always been fairly conservative, I probably shouldn't even use that word lest we get confused with modern day politics. The South has always been very traditional, right? They've seen themselves as an agrarian republic, very much in Jefferson's model. And they want to have things stay the way that they are. And they notice that the North is changing a whole bunch because of the market revolution and because of the antebellum reforms. And they're the ones that see themselves as sort of the guardians of the traditional ways of traditional American ways of doing things. And so the South is going to become increasingly different from the North and the West that are more connected. And this is, of course, going to lead to more sectional tensions that are going to lead to the Civil War. You can't talk about the Civil War without talking about slavery, its cause, of course. And slavery is all caught up in this about how they're putting more money into slaves than into railroads. They need market connections in order to sell their cotton, which means they need more enslaved people. They're going to have people moving to the Black Belt because of slavery and the soil that gets produced there. We're going to eventually manifest destiny our way west because of slavery in a lot of ways. The Missouri Compromise is necessary in 1820 because of this, taking over Texas during this time period, the Mexican-American War, you name it, it's all tied back to slavery, so that's a big deal. So if you can mention slavery, you can mention cotton, you have a lot of ways to go here with society, with politics, with the economy. Sounds great. Yeah. Thomas with a great answer. He says, sectionalism intensifies as cotton cultivation spreads south and west expands, and demand for cotton increases. This is largely caused by the market revolution because of demands for new raw materials, so therefore westward expansion increases political tensions. Bravo, that's like a full SAQ right there. Nice work, nice work. Yeah. So sectional tensions, regional tensions are going to explode during this time period, partly caused by the market revolution. Sounds good. I got one more for you, and that is this. What was a specific effect of the market revolution on American democracy? Now, you could take this as being about Jacksonian democracy and public participation. You could also take this in a political direction, kind of like what Thomas just did, talking about political tensions over slavery as they move west. We've already talked about that, so let's get another one. And this time, Vicky, I'm going to try to shut up so that way you can type out some answers without me talking about it first. So a specific effect of the market revolution on American democracy from 1820 to 1850. As a side, while I'll allow you some time to type, A reminder that 1820 is the same year of the Missouri Compromise, or the Missouri Appeasement, as some people are calling it, and that was when the North and the South had this compromise. Maine gets to be a free state, Missouri gets to be a slave state, and then anything below Missouri's southern border, 36 degrees, 30 minutes north, is going to be a slave state, and anything north is going to be a free state, possibly because, well, they thought they could maybe take over some of the Caribbean or some of the parts of Mexico, but also because cotton doesn't necessarily grow well up north anyway, so the Southerners didn't feel like they were losing out too much. Remember, you got to keep those balance between the states and the Senate, even though the South has increased representation in the House because of the Three-Fifths Compromise that allows them to artificially inflate their numbers. They're still worried about representation in the Senate, and to be honest, in the House too, because all these immigrants are going largely to the north. Ooh, that's another important point we should have mentioned. A lot of these immigrants, such as the German and the Irish, are going to be moving up north, largely because there are port cities, but also because that's where all the factories are. So a lot of these immigrants move to the north. Let's see. A specific effect of American Revolution, or market revolution on American democracy. Vicky says immigrants coming into the United States looking for the American dream. Absolutely. We see broader, more participation in democracy, more immigrants coming in. This is going to lead to nativism. This is going to lead to the American Know-Nothing Party. Absolutely. And so immigrants coming in looking for the American dream, that just changes American democracy, right? We have more people from more places. Absolutely. One more thing that so since we gave Vicky a chance to answer there, one more thing that we should say about American democracy is that American democracy is going to become way broader and more participatory. Thank you, Vicky. Appreciate you participating this evening. It helps out a lot. One of the things that the market revolution, and particularly the communication revolution, is going to do is it makes democracy much more broader, and it makes it a lot more participatory. More people can participate. This is the era of universal white manhood suffrage, the age of Jackson, right? Where the voting population expands a whole lot because we start to remove property qualifications. There's large literacy, especially up north, thanks to these common schools, thanks to Protestantism. You want to be able to read the Bible, so that way you get trained, but that also allows you to participate in democracy. So a lot of these newspaper inventions that we were talking about, the steam-powered driven press, the continuous roll, the roller press, the penny press, the tin type, things that enable you to make newspapers faster and cheaper, will enable you to print things. This is also, again, tied up with the antebellum reform movements. Antebellum reform movements such as abolitionism are able to spread their propaganda, and I mean that in the nicest way possible, spread their excellent news and good stuff all over the country because the printing gets cheaper and faster, and thus they're able to spread their pamphlets and their books and their articles and their pictures. So one of the effects of the market revolution on American democracy is an increased connectedness. People are able to get business news, sure, but also political news, and that's going to be huge for people participating in these new political parties because it's not just going to be people around Washington, D.C. or New York City who are making the decisions. It's people across this increasingly widespread republic. Remember, James Madison was a little bit nervous about having a large republic. But then he said, well, it just produces more factions, which can make people have fewer problems with political parties because they can cancel each other out. Alexander Hamilton was a little bit nervous because he was afraid that increased size with the Louisiana Purchase would lead to it's hard to govern over that with a centralized government. So the Federalists were a little bit nervous about this. The Whigs are a little bit nervous about this, partly because, again, they don't like this decentralized government, but also because they want an American system. They want to improve what we already have, infrastructure where we are, and the market revolution, which includes westward expansion. The westward expansion is going to be largely championed by Democrats. Think James K. Polk and the Mexican-American War. So one of the effects on American democracy is increased party politics and divide as the Whigs and the Democrats go at it over the American system, over the wisdom of even expanding in the first place, and then over the wisdom of how much the federal government should be invested in the American system and infrastructure, which is part of the market revolution. All right. Those are the SAQs that I have, and we are almost out of time. I wanted to ask, do you have any questions? Do you have any concerns, things that I can answer for you now as we go through some of this stuff? As I wait for you to think about questions, just a brief recap of what we're talking about here. Largely, the market revolution is caused by westward expansion as people move westward over the Appalachian Mountains into the former Northwest Territory, into the Black Belt region, into the Louisiana Purchase. They have to be able to stay connected. Therefore, they want to be able to connect faster through things like the steamboat, through the telegraph, all of these inventions. We talked about a whole bunch of different inventions this evening. Those inventions would include things like the telegraph, the steamboat, the cotton gin. A lot of this is tied in with slavery. A lot of it's tied in with communication and transportation of various sorts of goods. People are able to sell things for a market. And remember, the market revolution, as people have asked about, is people selling goods for faraway markets, aka faraway people who want to buy things from you for cash. They're not trading. We're not bartering. We're not making things just for ourselves and being self-sufficient. You're probably going to specialize in one particular item and sell that to the overall marketplace, and you need to be able to transport that a lot better. We talked about some inventions, like I said, and then a lot about how that turns into different effects of various sorts. Erie Canal, right, decreases shipping costs, makes it a whole lot more efficient, and thus people are able to transport things faster, cheaper. People are able to communicate better, which leads to more broad participatory democracy. Whigs versus Democrats, we talked about that. Whigs led by Henry Clay, the Democrats by Andrew Jackson. Whigs are much more okay with federal government assistance with these infrastructure projects, internal improvements. It's known as the American system. Democrats, much less okay with this. They want regional, local people to make those decisions, and they think that it's largely unconstitutional to be able to have the federal government do all these things because it doesn't say it in the Constitution, and they are strict constructionists. Then we talked about various effects of this market revolution. Is it even a revolution at all? That's a great question to ask because it leads you to look at some things and go, well, the Americans during the, let's say, early Republic period or during the colonial period, they were trading with each other. They were selling things. Doesn't that count? Sure. How much of a revolution is this? Is it a big deal? And then you can also say, well, but there are some things that are just different, right? This leads to tons of people being able to trade way more. And it's not just Pinckney's treaty that opens up New Orleans on the Mississippi River in the 1790s. It's also the steamboat that opens up the Mississippi River because that enables us to go upstream. And that's a big deal, and it leads to lots of increases in transportation, in communication, in hauling goods, and who we're selling to. It looks like we don't have any other questions, so I'll just add one more thing at the very end. One more thing about this is that, again, I want to emphasize the historical thinking skills. Historical thinking skills that are kind of my thing, especially on these streams, it seems like. Those are incredibly helpful when it comes to emphasizing what's the important stuff in your notes, the important stuff in the lectures, the important stuff in the course in general. Be aware of compare and contrast. Be aware of change and continuity over time, and be aware of cause and effect or causation. You need to know those because it's a good way to compare things and to be able to put new knowledge into existing frameworks. So the market revolution is a prime example of cause and effect. We're talking about these westward expansion as a cause and the effect being on democracy, being on westward expansion, etc., the economy. And we can also talk about change and continuity over time. That's a great question for, was it actually revolutionary? And then with compare and contrast, you can talk about the effects that you can compare and contrast of the North versus the South and how they all interact with the market revolution. So, good way to structure your stuff. I don't think we have any more questions or concerns. In that case, thank you very much for watching. Thanks for participating. Those of you that were able to throw some stuff in the chat, we always appreciate that. The more, the merrier. And remember, you got this. If you got a period 4 test coming up, you got this. Watch some 5-able videos. Take some good notes. Quiz yourself. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time. And again, good luck on your APUSH. You folks can do it. You're fantastic. Have a great night.